Welcome back. Today we begin our studies with some of the oldest stories known to man besides the scriptures. We're going to discuss the great benefit of getting a liberal arts education in the great books, then an introduction to the man Homer, and finally an introduction to the first 4 books of the Odyssey. Studying the great books gives greater perspective. C.S. Lewis said, "The only palliative is to keep the clean sea breeze of the centuries blowing through our minds, and this can be done only by reading old books." He wrote that in a book called God in the Dock. We really are able to get different perspectives on questions that we may not have thought about before as we read the great books, and we get a better understanding of our culture and heritage, and that's a valuable thing. You know, we have been rejecting history in our modern day, but we really are indebted to the great books of the past because they have influenced everything we do. Aristotle and his ethics and what we learn about the golden mean. Then there's Plato and all his ideas from his book called The Republic, and how we get ideas of all the different kinds of governments and which ones work and which ones don't. And Shakespeare and all of his ideas about human nature. And then there's Milton, who gives us a great perspective of the creation, the fall, and the atonement of Jesus Christ. And he actually was quite against some of the doctrines of Catholicism in his book. He actually is closer to what we believe in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in regards to the creation, the fall, and the atonement. These are great books that have shaped our culture. Now, in a previous lecture, I talked about how the great books get us involved in the great conversation. What is the great conversation? Well, it is a culmination of all the ideas that created, maintained, and moved civilizations. It is grounded in natural law and truth, and includes many errors to which we come to understand the truth better by virtue of seeing the errors. Maynard Hutchins, who's the father of the great books, said, "The tradition of the West is embodied in the great conversation that began in the dawn of history and that continues to the present day." He also says that a liberal education frees a man from the prison house of his class, race, time, place, background, family, and even his nation. He says also that nobody can decide for himself whether he's going to be a human being. The only question open to him is whether he will be an ignorant, undeveloped one, or one who has sought to reach the highest point he is capable of attaining. Really, the grand purpose of studying the great books is to become who God created us to become. And we do that by finding truths. Truth comes by study and by faith. In the 88th section, it says, and this is from the Doctrine and Covenants, it says, and as all have not faith, seek ye diligently and teach one another words of wisdom. Yea, seek ye out of the best books words of wisdom, seek learning, even by study and also by faith. And that's verse 118 of section 88. Now, as I've said in previous lectures, Mortimer Adler teaches us that when we study the great books, we must look for the few truths amidst all the error. And when we find an error, the truth will be on one or the other side of the error. So an example of finding a truth on one side of the error would be, for instance, you're going to hear from time to time both the words liberty and freedom, and they're used simultaneously. One error that many adhere to is the freedom to do what one pleases. Is that agency? No. The error is that freedom to do whatever one wants to do has little or no responsibility connected to it. Think of Victor Frankenstein, who carries his scientific ideas too far in creating his monster, and it becomes a bigger problem than Victor himself. he mistook his freedom for unabashed bulldozing into error. So what is the truth in that situation? Well, one truth is that freedom has to work alongside honesty, responsibility, and humility. Those Christ-like attributes connected to freedom will maintain the truth. So you see, as you look at these errors, the ideas that you will find that are in error, you're going to see truth on the other side of them. And usually is when you add in natural law and you add in Christ-like attributes, you'll see the truth. Now, of course, while the scriptures contain the revelatory truth, there are many characters in scriptures who do not live or preach the truth, but we can readily see where they err. For instance, look at David and Bathsheba. Look at Laman and Lemuel most of the time. Look at Nehor, Korhor, and Zeezrom, especially in his early days. And then there's the Pharisees and the Sadducees. All these are examples of people taking parts of the truth but distorting it by being dishonest, irresponsible, and prideful. The key to finding truth, then, is to apply the principles of natural law to each thought and action. And the great books will give us hundreds of hours of practice in finding truths amidst error. And eventually and ultimately, it will fine-tune our hearts and our minds. Fate is a main theme that we're going to see in the ancient Greeks. And here's a painting of the three fates, and they are a group of three weaving goddesses who assign individual destinies to mortals at birth. Fate is primarily a decree or word pronounced by God, or a fixed sentence by which the order of things is prescribed. And what that really means is that basically the Greeks believed that the gods were directing everything, and that anything that ever happened was because the gods wanted it to happen. And there are some words that are derived from fate. For instance, you've heard of a fatal accident. Somebody has a fatal illness. The word fatal, F-A-T-A-L, that just means causing death or destruction. Fatalism is a doctrine that events are fixed in advance, fixed in advance, which means that they're set up, they're just going to happen, and that human beings are powerless to change them. Now, in our modern day, if we thought of fatalism like that, it would result in despair. But Homer doesn't seem to portray that despair. The characters really have hope and faith in the gods. And fate is actually quite the opposite of what we understand as agency, or the power to choose for ourselves. And the Greeks may have understood something better than we do. We know that God knows what has happened, and what is happening, and what will happen to each of us individually. That last part is a hard concept for us to grasp. He knows how we will choose. He knows us so well that he anticipates our choices. We also learn from doctrine that Heavenly Father can see the future. He can actually see what we will choose before we even choose it. So come with me as I explain how this could look a lot like fate. It's not quite, but it looks like it. So as you read as you read Homer and you see how things play out, you will notice the characters choosing their thoughts and actions. But the mood of the poem seems like God is decreeing all their thoughts and actions. The ancients felt that God was decreeing them, but was he really? Well, I say not. I think they chose and gave the glory to the gods, and the gods were choosing for them. I think they chose and gave the glory to the gods that the gods were choosing for them and compelling them to make those choices. But they really made those choices themselves. So the idea of fate for the ancients was basically, quote, our life is simply what the gods dish out to us. And the characters know their job is to fight, to love, to serve, to honor others, to die with virtue, etc. So do you see the difference there? Agency is we choose for ourselves. But there's also another doctrine that we know, that God knows what we're going to choose. Well, what's so different about that and fate, in that you're going to see the Greeks are making all sorts of choices in their thoughts and their actions, and they attribute all that they do to the gods making them do that, and that they're okay with it. But really, to me, it looks like they have all sorts of agency, but that the gods know everything that's going to happen, and that they will be know exactly what they're going to be choosing. It's kind of confusing, but hopefully we'll get more into that discussion as we go along the way. And if you have any questions, please bring them up. I'd love to have some great discussions on fate. Now, here is Homer. 3 different busts of Homer. He lived around 800 BC, so about 200 years before Lehi came to America. And he lived for close to 100 years. He was a blind poet, and he lived in Ionia. And Ionia is on the other side of, it's still Greece, but it's on the other side of the Mediterranean near Turkey. Okay? And he composed 2 great epic poems. One is called the Iliad, and the other is called the Odyssey. And we're going to be reading the Odyssey this year. And this artwork here is a depiction of the shield of Achilles. Achilles is the main player in the Iliad. And there's a beautiful simile in the Iliad about the shield of Achilles. And if you look at this shield, you're going to see a bunch of ideas about daily living. There's some things about agriculture, there's feasting, there's family gatherings, domestic life. There's marrying and giving in marriage. There's fighting and warring. There's birth and death. It's really a current picture of our own day. Now, the 2 epic poems are vastly different from each other. We're not going to be reading the Iliad, but I'm going to go into a little bit of the history of it, the summary of it, because you've got to know it in order to see the big picture with Odysseus, or the Odyssey. So these 2 epic poems are vastly different from each other. The styles are different. The tone is different. Some scholars feel that each must have been composed by different poets because they're so different. But others say that, no, it's Homer, but he composed them at different times of his life. And we don't know the truth. And it's been so long ago, and there isn't any history around it. But the latter scholars say that the Iliad must have been composed at the height of Homer's life, and the Odyssey at the twilight of his life. The Odyssey is quite developed and a more mature theme. The Iliad is all about the Trojan War, which happened in the 12 and 1100s. It's the most commonly read epic poem, whereas the Odyssey is less known and is less widely read. The Iliad is a well-constructed and developed plot. There's a lot of sidetracks in it. There's a lot of digressions. And the reason why is because it's basically a story about this war, and in order to make it very interesting, you go back in time to see the history of some of the characters. So it gives you a better backdrop of the story. And these digressions are told in epic similes. And as you know, simile is where a character is compared as something else or like something else. And the Iliad is a tragedy. It's a tragedy of a man It's a tragedy of Achilles. It's a story of his failure. He never mastered his anger and his pride. And you see a lot of men go home after this, and their lives are pretty much ruined. One, Agamemnon, and we're going to read a play about him a little later, he gets murdered by his wife. Whereas the Odyssey is a story of success. Odysseus goes home from the Trojan War and he saves his kingdom. He saves his wife and his son from all these 100 suitors that are trying to woo Penelope into marrying them. The Trojan War takes 10 years, and Odysseus's journey home from Troy takes 10 years because he's been wandering, trying to find his home. And Poseidon is upset with him. He's the god of the sea, and he's been very upset with him, and he won't help Odysseus get home. So think about this. How long has Odysseus been away from home? If the Trojan War has taken 10 years and his journey home takes 10 years, yeah, he's been gone 20 years. And his son was just a baby when he left, and now he's 20 years old when he gets home, when Odysseus gets home. So if the Odyssey is not a tragedy, what is it? So for centuries, stories with a happy ending were known as comedies. A comedy is a story with a happy ending, and often it culminates in a wedding celebration. Think of Shakespeare, and a lot of his comedies end in a wedding celebration. So a comedy also shows the hero who accomplishes what he set out to do. Another interesting name for or style of writing is this is a romance, and that's an old definition because it's not a love story, although it sure is at the end. But a romance way back when was an adventure story. But now, of course, romances are those paperback books that are sold cheaply at every stand that you can imagine that talk about love and passion. So on the left-hand side of this slide, you see a depiction of the Trojan War in the Iliad. And this is one narrative about what's going on between the Achaeans and the Trojans. So the Achaeans are the Greeks, and the Trojans are the men from Troy, which is a city in Turkey, modern-day Turkey. And that's basically the whole story, is that one idea going on. Whereas the Odyssey has several major threads running parallel to it. And that's called polysemous. It's a polysemous thought. Many, many different things going on. Two of the main things are up at the top right, you see Odysseus. He's trying to get back home. And there's a god, I don't know if it's Poseidon, I don't know if it's another god, but trying to make it really hard for him. And then on the bottom, Telemachus. This is not a picture of Telemachus. This is actually Odysseus and Penelope, but Telemachus is trying to get his father back home too, and he goes on his own journey of growing up. So he's never had a father growing up. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. But Telemachus leaves Ithaca, the island of Ithaca, and he tries to find his father and then get him home to help the family. And those two, Odysseus and I said Telemachus, but it's Telemachus. Odysseus and Telemachus get together. They're brought together in the middle of the poem. And the background really comes into focus a lot more in this book than it does in the Iliad. There's a lot less epic similes because we see the background, whereas the Iliad needs the epic similes to see the background. The Odyssey begins just like the Iliad, with an invocation to the Muses. In the first 12 lines of the poem, and you can read along with me if you've got your book, or go get your book and read along with me, but First of all, in the ancient Greek religion and mythology, the Muses are an inspirational, a group of inspirational goddesses of literature, science, and the arts. And they're considered the source of the knowledge embodied in the poetry, lyric songs, and myths that were related orally for centuries in these ancient cultures. In this particular poem, Zeus's daughter is actually the muse, and you're going to see that in the first 12 lines. Here they go. He says, so Homer is asking the muses, he's saying, sing to me of the man, muse, the man of twists and turns, driven time and again off course. Once he had plundered the hallowed heights of Troy. Many cities of men he saw and learned their minds. There's a little typo there. Many pains he suffered, heartsick on the open sea, fighting to save his life and bring his comrades home. But he could not save them from disaster, hard as he strove. The recklessness of their own ways destroyed them all. The blind fools, they devoured the cattle of the sun, and the sun god wiped from sight the day of their return. So the theme is the story of this wandering, of this man trying to get home. He's a curious man. He's a man of many ways, a mind that turns quickly and fluidly, and a mind that is nimble and agile. He's a good thinker. He's an intelligent man. And all these epithets about him are about thoughtfulness, circumspection, prudence. And Penelope's wife is thoughtful too. She's often called circumspect Penelope because she looks around. She considers all sides. You're going to see this as we see how they get out of their problems. Telemachus is thoughtful also. He's considerate. He's not rash like the other Greek characters in the Iliad. So Odysseus sees many cities. He learns of many minds. He suffers pain in the spirit on the wide sea, and he struggles for his own life. He thinks about his experiences, and he becomes wiser. There are struggles in his journey to bring his companions home safely. You can see that in these first 12 lines, but he cannot do it because they are fools. You're gonna see that they're gonna attack the sacred cows of the sun gods, and you're going to see how much they are fools later on as you read this. So Homer invokes the daughter of Zeus to tell the story of Odysseus, and that's how we begin. So we begin the story in medias res, which means it's a Latin phrase denoting that we're going to be starting in the middle of the story, and sometimes it even means at the end of the story, rather than beginning at the beginning. So right there in the middle of the story, we are up at Mount Olympus, where all the gods are, and they're having a council, and they're deciding to send Athena to Ithaca, the island of Ithaca, to stir up Telemachus somehow to go on a journey and seek his father. He's in the middle of problems with all of these suitors trying to, they're eating them out of house and home, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But Telemachus does not know how to fight them, and so Athena gets him to go on a journey to seek his father. And the Council of the Gods decide to send Hermes to Calypso on her island. And this is where Odysseus has been stranded for 7 years. And he's weeping every day on the beach because he wants to go home. He doesn't want to be captured by her. So then we follow Athena for the first 4 books. And Athena comes to Telemachus in disguise of a man named Mentor. And this is who Odysseus left to care for Telemachus when he left. So here's Athena, disguised as Mentor, and she says, why don't you go find your father? And this is where we get the idea of a mentor. A mentor advises and counsels and guides people. And the first 4 books are all about Telemachus kind of growing up and leaving home to find out a little bit about his father. And so we called it, the ancient name for the first 4 books of the Odyssey is called the Telemachy. 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 And then book 5 shifts to Odysseus. And we see the shift go from thread to thread, plus a few shifts up to Mount Olympus where the gods are. Now, books 1 and 2, Athena's going to visit Telemachus, like we know, on the island of Ithaca, and we see him in contrast to the suitors of Penelope, who are famously eating Odysseus out of house and home, or rather his wife Penelope, who's left behind. And there are over 100 suitors, and they're spending day after day in the house. Even some of the maids and stable boys are siding with the suitors, and all of them are persecuting young Telemachus, who's probably about 17 or 18 years old here. And Telemachus is really an untested, untried in battle, and has not earned the respect of the suitors who are flocking to his house each day. And on the insisting of Mentor, Telemachus leaves, gets a ship, and sails away to find his father. In book 3, he comes to the land of King Nestor, who was the wise old counselor in the Iliad, and he's welcomed by him. And Nestor is in the process of sacrificing hecatomb, which means 100 oxen. And he's sacrificing on the beach, and they're having a great feast. And they welcome him, and they bathe him, and they dress him, and they feed him. There's a lot of hospitality going on. The Greeks love hospitality. That's one of their main things that they feel is the most important. One of the most important things. They give him a warm bed, and Telemachus asks Nestor what he knows about his father, because Telemachus is gathering information. That's his basic role right now, is gathering information about his father. And book 4, Telemachus now leaves Nestor, who lives in the southwest corner of Greece in a region called Pylos. And then he travels east overland to Sparta, which is also in southern Greece, in the region known as the Peloponnesus. And this is where King Menelaus lives with his wife Helen. Now, by the way, we get to know who Nestor and Menelaus and Helen are in the Iliad, but since you're not reading that, just know that they are characters that were also in the war. So he ends up staying quite some time with Menelaus, and he'll stay there while the scene shifts in book 5. And we won't even come back to him until 10 books later. So in book 4, while Telemachus is visiting with Menelaus and Helen gets out her spinning basket, spinning yarn, and she's quite domestic, and it's quite a peaceful scene. But the topic of the Trojan War comes up because Telemachus is seeking information about his father, of course. And this can be a pretty tense topic because terribly sad memories are associated with it. 10 years of absence, 10 years of battle, of comrades, friends, loved ones falling in battle, and many men have been killed and left behind. And as the subject turns toward the war, the moods become more solemn, and many tears are shed. And Helen brings out a little medicine that she picked up when she was off in Egypt, and she drops it into the wine of all the feasters. We don't know what the medicine is, but she does manage to cheer them all up. And they continue talking about the Trojan War, and in the course of the conversation, Menelaus tells an interesting story that has little to do about Odysseus, but it is most intriguing because it fits in with what the great Roman epic poem hundreds of years later, the Aeneid, will say about the fall of Troy. And if you follow me for next year, we will read this epic poem as well from from Rome, and it's written about, I'm going to say 30, 40 years before Christ is born. So Menelaus says, well, no, let me just pause here for a moment and talk about what the Aeneid by Virgil, the Roman epic, tells us about the fall of Troy. So it kind of takes off from these epic poems and builds on some more of the myth. So the Greeks pretended to sail away from Troy at the end of the Trojan War, and they were leaving behind a great wooden horse, which was designed and planned by Odysseus and built by the carpenter Opius and filled with Greek warriors. So inside there's a bunch of Greek warriors in there. And of course, you most know the story, and it's pretty much the most famous episode in the whole Trojan War cycle. It's a giant wooden horse full of Greek soldiers. So there's a plant left behind. And what I mean by plant, it's not a plant, but it's actually a person left behind that's planted there that has an agenda. A man named Sinon, says Virgil in his poem, a man named Sinon, hands bound, gag in his mouth. The Trojans find him struggling in the swamp nearby, and they took off the bonds and the gag and asked him, "Who are you?" And he tells a lying story. He's a plant. He has been planted there by the Greeks. He tells the story saying that the Greeks are cruel men. Don't return them to me. It's a good thing they've left, he says. They've sailed away and they gave up, and they left behind this great wooden horse as a gift to Minerva, which is the Roman name for Athena. And they left it behind to placate her anger. They know they can never take the city, so they're gone for good. And the Trojans ask him, well, why is the horse so big? Sinon says, so you can't get it into the city. The Greeks know that if you can get the horse inside the city, your city will be impregnable forever. And the Trojans say, cool. Basically, they say that. And they tear down the wall and they prepare to drag the horse inside because they want their city to be impregnable. That means it can never be taken again. So Virgil, this is the author of the Aeneid, who we'll read next year. Virgil then tells us a number of omens that appear that should have warned the Trojans not to take the horse inside. Laocoon, the priest of Poseidon, of Neptune, comes out of the city and says, I know it's a trick. And he throws the spear into the side of the horse, and it sticks with a hollow thrumming sound. Well, that should have warned the people. But just then 2 great snakes come out of the sea and destroy Laocoon and his 2 boys. And so all the Trojans think, oh, he must have been lying. Because if something bad happens to somebody, they think, oh, he must have been lying. And they continue dragging the horse inside the city. Cassandra, who's a daughter of King Priam, a priestess of Apollo, who has been cursed by Apollo with a gift of always telling the truth and never being believed. Can you imagine that kind of a curse? She comes raging out of the city, tearing at her hair and saying, no, it's a trick. Don't take the horses inside. But the Trojans laughed. Who ever believed Cassandra? And they continue preparing to drag the horse inside. So the third thing that should have warned them as they drag the horse over the broken down wall, they hear the rattle of metal inside the belly of the horse and something that sounds like armor. This also doesn't warn them. And Aeneas, who tells the story in the Aeneid, said, the gods have blinded our minds. But now, to return to the Odyssey, in Book 4, Menelaus tells us one more story about what happened at the Trojan horse. He says, Helen, do you remember when you came out of the city and you walked around that horse? And she chuckles and said, yes, I remember. Menelaus continued, you walked around that horse, staring at his belly and calling out the name of each man inside, and every one of us hiding inside the horse heard our own wife's voice. Talk about a strange scene. What would have what would it have looked like to the Trojans who were standing there watching Helen walk around the horse, calling out the names of all the men inside? Wouldn't that clue the Trojans into something? She's calling out the names of Greek heroes and staring at the horse. How could they not catch on? Well, the Greeks inside the horse, hoping not to be discovered, each hear his own wife's voice, the voice of a beloved woman he hasn't talked to for 10 years. He hears her voice just outside the horse, and Diomedes, we are told, almost cries out, "Honey, I am in here." And Odysseus puts his hand over Diomedes' mouth and says, "Shut up, you fool. Do you really think your wife would be in Troy?" What a strange story to hear. So Menelaus tells the story to Helen. "Do you remember all this?" She chuckles and says, "Yes, I don't know what came over me. I must have been bewitched." It's a very odd story. So Menelaus continues to tell the information that he heard about Odysseus after they left Troy. And there's stories about some of the sailors being blown off course, and some of the warriors like Agamemnon himself. Like I said before, they meet with tragedy when they get home. Agamemnon is murdered by his wife shortly after he gets back home, and we're going to read about that in a play. Like I said before, that's pretty tragic. Some of the sailors drown at sea. Some of them don't find their way back home for some time. But Menelaus has no real solid information about Odysseus at all for Telemachus. So, at the close of Book 4, we have Telemachus on the search for his father, seeking information, and at the beginning of Book 5, the scene will shift, and we'll turn our attention to Odysseus stranded on the island of Calypso. So, with that, the assignment is to read books 1 through 4, and hopefully this 40-minute video has helped you to understand a little bit about what you're going to read. The next videos are not going to be as thorough, but will help you to get to know a little bit of the summary. You're also assigned to read the summaries of each chapter so that you know what you're reading before you get into it. The reason why we do that is that if you are trying to read a book without knowing the story, then you're going to spend all that time trying to figure out the story. Whereas if you already know a little bit about the story, you're going to spend a little bit more time looking at ideas and a lot of time finding truths and errors or things that you can use in your own life. So that's why we really highly recommend that you read the summaries before you get going in your books. With that, we'll see you in class, and have a wonderful time reading.